I'm gonna steal your mic. Everyone, how's it going? You are on Finding Your Path in Climate Tech. So if you were looking for something else, the exit's right there. But thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Schrepfer. I am the founder of Gigascale Capital. I am also most recently someone who switched out of a long 23-year career in tech to focus my time and attention on climate tech. So, I spent, before this, I was the CTO of Meta and had founded a technology company in the 2000s, a software company. And so I still remember, since it's only a few years ago, the sort of journey from one to the other. And so if any of you in this room are thinking about it now and are maybe having some weird combination of being overwhelmed with the possibilities, a little frightened about what it means for your career, and at the same time a little excited about what the possibilities are, that is at least how I felt or feel still today. But part of why I'm excited to have this amazing group of panelists here that you're going to hear from shortly, as soon as I get off the stage, is to talk about not just one path, but multiple paths through this jungle gym to discover how to take your talent, your skills, your energy, and apply it to the climate crisis. And I'll just say one quick thing, which is, the good news, bad news about the climate crisis is it's huge. It affects everything. We're changing the way we live in buildings, we transport ourselves around, we make food, we make materials. It's pretty much everything in our economy. It's an industrial revolution 2.0. That's bad because it means it's sort of overwhelming. Like, what part of that can I plug myself into? But the good side of that is it means there's tons of opportunities for people of all skill sets and backgrounds. If you're good at consumer marketing, if you're good at B2B sales, if you're good at engineering, hardware or software, good at product design, if you're good at finance, there are tons of jobs for you in climate tech that utilize each of those skills that are critical to the success of a new business. So, assembled here today, we have this amazing panel, but I'm first going to introduce our moderator. Jill is a founder herself. She comes out of the tech world herself, too, formerly at Airbnb. She founded an amazing company called Growth by Design, who helps early-stage startups figure out how to not just hire, but to sort of build their engine and machine around the people function and hiring. And they become close partners of Gigascale and work with us on everything from our own firm to all the startups we build together. So, Jill, thank you for hosting and moderating today. I'll give you your mic back.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike. And I'd love to start just by having the panelists do a little introduction of themselves. So maybe I'd love for each of you just to share your role, and also because there is such a range of technologies, just like a quick snippet of what your company does, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into how you came into the climate space to begin with.
Sure. Is this on? Yeah. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm Chief Commercial Officer and one of the co-founders of CO280. We are a tech agnostic project developer in the CDR space. That's carbon dioxide removal. So what we're doing is we're building large carbon dioxide removal projects at pulp and paper mills using commercially available technology, taking that CO2 and storing it permanently underground. And then we market those credits to voluntary market buyers.
Wonderful. So. Thanks, Alicia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Harmon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Arbor Energy. We are a BECCS bioenergy carbon capture and storage. Basically a CDR plus clean energy company. It's a team of rocket scientists from SpaceX that figured out a way to take their rocket engine knowledge from SpaceX and use that to basically generate both electricity and sequesterable carbon with their turbo machinery. And so I'm the only non-engineering degree in the building. It's a lot of fun.
Hi, my name is Selina Tobaccowala. My company is called HomeBoost. We're still in public beta. So if you go to the site, it'll say sign up for a wait list. But our company is trying to help consumers understand their residential energy home consumption. So we have a DIY home energy audit.
Wow, all so fascinating. So I'd love to just hear, since the title of the panel is Forging Your Way into Climate, just how did each of you forge your way into climate to begin with? And maybe just a quick story about it, and we'll delve into it a little bit more deeply after.
Yeah, do you want me to start
yes,
this
please.
end? Okay.
Yeah.
I spent the very early part of my career working in tech sales. I call it regular tech. So I worked for a startup called Wildfire and then one called Waze, which more people have heard of, and ended up at Google for a number of years selling advertising. And I had a moment that a lot of people in this industry, and I'm sure a lot of you have had, where I realized that if I didn't work on climate, I'd never really care about what I did. And at the time, looked around. For an English major, there were not a lot of jobs available in the space. So I had a realization that I needed to qualify myself for the space and went back to school to get a master's in science mid-career. I don't think that's necessary anymore, just to let you guys know, and ended up working for Climeworks, which is a big direct air capture company based out of Switzerland. I was their first employee in North America and ended up here after that.
So I would say I'm kind of industry agnostic. I've spent more of my career just focusing more on strategy and operations across a lot of different industries. Started my career in politics, though. Education and conservation have always been sort of really important issues to me, kind of the building blocks for our society. And I, also did kind of the regular tech thing. I like that. And I did a stint at Deloitte where I, worked for companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron and Toyota, and realized that I really needed to be doing something where I could really feel an impact in the work that I was doing, and that to me was startups. I worked at an ed tech company during the pandemic, and that really reminded me of what it means to not just have an impact in the work that you're doing, but in the work that you're doing in the world. And so that made me realize that I really wanted to focus more on impact companies. And then I have a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. And that was really, kind of to Natalie's point. It's like you have this moment where it's like, this is the only important thing. I don't want them to look at me in the future and ask, like, what did you do to help or hurt this problem? And so, I realized that climate is really where I wanted to focus my attention. And I just started having a lot of conversations with companies about where are you at, what are your problems, where's there parallels between what I've seen in all these other industries and what you guys are going through, and where can I apply myself?
So my background's all in consumer product and technology. So I started Evite many moons ago, worked at Ticketmaster, was very early at SurveyMonkey, recently did a health and fitness app. My health and fitness app got acquired. I was starting to think about what's next. And I got excited about the idea of working in climate for all the reasons people are saying, the kids being focused on it, like social impact along with sort of consumer problems. But I personally got very intimidated. Like, well, how am I going to actually make this switch? How am I going to make this change? Because I don't have a hard sciences degree. I don't have I had never done hardware. And actually, right in this building, there was, I think Mike was involved in it. They had a big climate draft event. And I was there and I was meeting all of these innovators. I met these scientists. I met these people that had built these like amazing products. And I kept asking, I was like, so how are you going to bring it to market? How are you going to talk to the consumer? And I kept getting a lot of like blank stares or like, well, I'm going to sell it just like I sell regular milk, or I'm going to sell this just like I sell. And I was like, consumers don't care that things are net zero. Like, how are you going to bring the consumer along? And I left that conference thinking, okay, I can add value. Like, I have the ability to think about how you can drive consumers through the experience and what they actually care about. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how we started or got to our company ideas, but one of the pieces was when I did all the consumer research for HomeBoost, it was very clear that the people who care about climate and homeowners are like not the same at all. And so even talking about climate in our marketing is not something that we're planning on.
Interesting. That's such a great lead in to the next question. And feel free, you all, if it comes to you, we can do popcorn and you can just answer when it comes to you. But I was curious to hear when you were making that transition, you touched on this a little bit, Selina, but like what were the main concerns you had or kind of obstacles to it, and how did you get past them? Like what were the biggest pieces in your way? Any of you?
Yeah. I mean, I can just, and then, for me, as I was saying, it was so much around the insecurity of how I could add value. I came with a computer science degree, but I had literally, built online invitations and things like that. It's very different than carbon capture or all these hard problems. And so to me, it was a lot around the personal intimidation of how can I do something in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that really hits on it in the idea of like the hard science that really goes into a lot of climate tech and climate companies. But I really started looking around in sort of the ESG space, carbon accounting, things that kind of mapped more closely to some of my more enterprise background and strategy and operations background. And it's funny, I came across Arbor because I was just really trying to learn more about the stage of maturity of a lot of the deep tech companies in the CDR space. I think there's a big narrative out there around what's happening in CDR and a lot of this deep tech, but then the reality of where these companies are at is much earlier. And so I just started reaching out to my network to have very casual conversations with different companies in these spaces. And, Arbor, it's funny, I mean, to say that I was intimidated by the level of science and the people in the room is like such an understatement, because these are literally like some of the top rocket scientists in the world in their space. Even the BD and commercial teams have, undergrad degrees, if not masters, in engineering. I got my degree in journalism and I have an MBA, but again, I don't think I've taken chemistry since sophomore year of high school. I did take 4 years of physics, so I do drive a little bit with the rocket scientists on that. But what I realized is that kind of to Selina's point, my experience outside of climate tech actually really helped push some of the boundaries of the thinking within the company, because engineers really think a certain way. And there was a lot of value that I could really add, again, just kind of thinking through the basic questions I would ask any company about where they were at. And that, really helped me see that there's more value I can add by having that external perspective than having that hard science background. That's kind of how I got past that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think climate tech is at a point right now where there's a lot of companies that are realizing that we need to grow up and we need to show that you can build a really good business that's also doing good for the world. I think that's one of the things that motivates us, is to be a lighthouse company in the space that does that. And to do that, you need business skills as well as engineering skills. And that's very clear to me. And I think that's a newer realization across the space. So what you guys said really resonates with me. In terms of what was hard about the transition, I think with any transition, while you're in it, it doesn't feel like a straight line. Even if when you tell the story later, it is a straight line. So like while you're in the middle of it, it feels like, you're going like this, even if you're getting from point A to point B in the end. So it's really just about like managing your own expectations and patience. And we do need everybody to work on this problem. We need all the skill sets, and finding your niche within it can be hard because it's still a relatively small space, but you will get there and it will feel like a straight line.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because we always say that, like, so I'm in recruiting. I talk to people all day about their careers, and there's nobody who has a straight line. They're always winding roads. And I think especially when people are switching industries, usually there's some kind of stepping stone that happens. So you don't go smoothly from one to the other. You might stop off and go to school for a while, or your aim is to go into a small company, but you go to a big company and take a smaller role, or whatever it might be. You might have to take a step back to take a step forward, but we so often see that. And I love that you highlighted that, because looking back, it always looks really clear. And like, this person was just going in one direction. And one thing that I love that all three of you said to some extent was, like, when you were far away from it, it felt like maybe like you couldn't see how you would add value. But then when you got close and started having conversations, you were like, oh, it's clear I can add value in different ways. I think that's really helpful, because Meryl was just sharing a study with me that was said I think 65% of people who want to go into climate say that the main reason that they're not going to is because they don't see how their skills would apply. So I think it's really helpful to know, okay, the closer you get to it, the more you get to know companies, the more you're going to see how your skills could map to what that company might need.
Yeah, I mean, every company has similar functions, right? Like, there are going to be some things that don't map necessarily, but in general, most people have a skill set, and it's really about identifying what your skill set is. Looking at yourself, looking at the through line of your career, looking at the skills that you've built up over that career, and kind of understanding about yourself what your expertise is from a skill set level, not necessarily like a subject matter level, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a lot of education that needs to be done on the company side as well, and making sure that we're doing a good job. I think about this a lot, with Arbor, where there's a very specific idea of the background or the skills that would make somebody good at a job. And the reality is, everything that we're doing in this space right now hasn't been done before. There's a lot of iterations and a lot of themes I think you can pull from history and other companies. And, some companies like Climeworks that are a little further ahead in the CR space, but in so many ways, this is all very nascent. And so, helping the companies themselves as well understand that, pulling people in with diverse backgrounds is going to help us navigate some of this ambiguity. And it's in some ways not as hard to read people up on these things as you might think. You don't need a PhD in rocket scientry to be able to kind of get the basics down, and just helping the company itself understand that, but also helping anyone you talk to in your network and the recruiters you talk to about like what are these skills that work in a lot of different ways that you can apply within these companies.
And I think just to add to that, there's also a lot of ways to get yourself more up to speed on the different spaces. So I took, there's a ton of books, obviously like the Gates book, and there's like a ton of different books. There's amazing podcasts, there's like the MCJ podcast, which is super interesting. And then there's also this, I took an actual course. It was one called Terra.do, but I took a course that kind of went through all the different areas, partially so I could start to understand, okay, where is consumer greenhouse gases actually having that impact? Is it food waste? Is it residential energy? But there's a huge amount of resources to try to start to get yourself educated as well, which I don't think is necessarily true in like every space. Like even carbon capture, like you can get the gist of carbon capture and understand what technologies are out there, fusion versus fission, without having a physics degree, at enough of a level that you can go feel like, oh, when I talk to this company, I'm not going to be intimidated to have that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there was, I would say 5 years ago, I would say the demand in climate tech for talent was higher than the supply of talent. And we're reaching kind of like I don't know if we're reaching an equilibrium, but what I'm seeing more and more is the companies we work with who are in climate want also to know that the person who's joining is passionate or interested in climate, not just like, oh, we just got this big round of funding and now you want to join us, which is kind of a shift in a dynamic. And so I think that educating yourself, also showing the initiative to learn as far as you can and not expect, that you're going to be the rocket scientist overnight, but to really show the initiative. Also, what I'm seeing from our companies is like they're hiring people who are showing that, even if that person hasn't worked in climate before.
Yeah, it's such a funny thing how I look back, and one of the things I really sweated when I was having these conversations and trying to figure out where I would fit in is, how do I show that I really am passionate about this and that I've done things, in this space? And the timing for me, it was like I just had young children. I, just come out of a job that kind of burned me out running an ed tech company during the pandemic. There wasn't a lot of time for even the easy, free things, the nonprofit work, the board, all these things that in your mind you're like, oh no, these are the check boxes I have to have, and nobody's going to take me seriously if I don't have them. And that's not just a climate tech thing. I think that's very much like we're all brainwashed to think that you have to have a checkbox on a lot of things. And what I realized is going through all the conversations I went through, and all the meetings I had. Nobody ever asked about that stuff. Nobody ever questioned any of that. It was the questions that I asked and being really engaged in the conversation and not being afraid to be like, I read this thing or I heard this thing. What's your perspective on it? Like, I have no idea what they're talking about, or that doesn't resonate to me. What's your thought on it? And opening up these big conversations, because people in climate are very passionate about it. And so that was my way of proving the passion, was just having those conversations and not making it a what's in it for me or what's in it for you, but just let's talk about this crazy space.
Yeah, I think so. When I made the transition, and I was maybe a little bit earlier career than either one of you guys, and it was hard to find folks at that time, which was I guess 6 or 7 years ago now, who would consider hiring me, even though I was doing really well at enterprise sales and sales management at Google, and the only jobs that I could really find at the time were selling cars for Tesla, which is a great job, but it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. And so to me, it was actually I did actually have to go qualify myself at that time. And I think it's different for mid-career folks than it is for later career folks. And I do think that the courses that exist now so helpful, and they're great ones out there. Like the one you did, really good. Yeah, yeah, really good courses out there, and a lot of them are free.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's like just an incredible community out there of people trying to learn. And,
Yeah.
like CDR, even once I started talking to Arbor before I was, coming on full time, I did an Air Miners boot up, like CDR book club. That was just like a weekly conversation with people and that were really engaged. And I felt like I just learned so much from just, again, engaging in people. And it wasn't just the people I wanted to normally network with to get a job. It was just talking to anybody I could.
I did that program too. Yeah, yeah. The Air Miners boot up. If you're looking at the
So
CDR
great.
space, yeah.
So great.
I'm curious if there's anything else in terms of like positioning your skills, or now that you all are probably on the hiring side of it, like, is there any other recommendations or tips you'd have for people on how to position their skill set as they're like moving into climate from something else?
Going back to this idea that skills are really transferable, and there's a lot of crazy things happening in climate tech right now. I think it's really helpful to go through your experience in your own resume and think about, like, not just the sort of responsibilities that you had, but like what were the projects you worked on? What were the problems that you solved, and how did you do that? And thinking about how you can apply that same logic to different things that are going on in the climate space. I started my career in politics. I was a political fundraiser. It's something I left behind a long time ago. Obviously my passion for these issues always survived, but like, it's funny how often I recall things from that time in my life decades ago in the work that I'm doing now. And just because it was a long time ago, or just because it's a very, very different space, doesn't negate any of that experience. And so I think a lot of it is just thinking about the real work that you've done and how it applies to spaces where there's not a lot of enabling, industry, or there's potential regulation implications, or, even like hiring practices or accounting. There's all of these different things that everyone's got experience with, and no matter where you are in your career, that's happening in climate tech now.
And I'd add to that, I'm on the board of a demand response energy company called Voltus. And, there's the energy markets team, which is like very, very specific of people that understand the energy markets and the grid and everything like that. But we've taken like an approach, especially on the software engineering side and the product design side and product, is like, we don't necessarily need people who've come from the space, because we want people who understand just how to build good software stack. We want to understand on the product side, like people that are thinking about how to make the UI great and UX great. And like, again, it's like, okay, if you have those energy markets experts, like what is the onboarding program we put the product leaders, the product people, and the software people through, so they understand the space? And so that's another thing, which is, as you're thinking about your skill set, is like asking a company, which is, okay, like I'm coming in sort of as a pure software engineer, and adding value, but like, how do I get up to speed on sort of the business part of this company, and making sure that there's like thoughtfulness in how the company does that. So that's like another aspect, which is like a lot of the companies, like your general skill set, you'll be able to add and add value, whether it's legal, finance, sales. But it's like, okay, how are you going to help me learn that specific thing, along with here's what I've done on my own to try to learn the space. And I think kind of bringing those two things together is important.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And in terms of maybe having something that's a stepping stone, like I see a lot of people really wanting to get into earlier climate tech companies or smaller, but those companies don't have the infrastructure to do things like you're talking about. So it might make sense to go to something that's a bit more developed, where they're actually going to be able to, like, you're going to be able to learn a bit more on the job, and then move to the next thing if that still is the thing you want to do after you've been there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's always easier to move around in a space after you're already in it and you've made connections. And I think that's a really astute thing to say, that like you take a step, even if it doesn't feel like your forever job. And sometimes when you're job hunting, like it feels like a forever commitment, but it's not, right? You're moving into a new industry and a new space, and maybe you spend a year, maybe you spend 2 years. That will go faster than you think.
I think that process is so important too internally, like, to really go through how do I feel about doing this work, or what is it that bothers me about it, so you can figure out where to go, because there is so much. And I think Mike made a really good point too, that there's, for every industry or for every passion, there's that plus climate. There's sustainable fashion, there's consumer goods that have a climate component to it. And for me, there was a lot of things that I thought I'd find really interesting that really vibed with my background, that made a lot of sense. That when I started talking to people or doing like little one-off projects, that's kind of how I realized I was just selling myself doing little one-off projects of things that I could do. And I realized like, oh, this is kind of boring to me, or I don't like this. And I never would have thought about even deep tech or anything hardware, because it's not my background, if I hadn't just been out there testing the waters for me internally about what I wanted to do. And so having those first steps that may not feel good, that's just as important as having the step that feels great.
Speaking of not feeling good, I think one of the things that also keep people from diving into climate tech is just this perception that it can be doom and gloom and that the work is heavy. I know from the companies that we work with in climate tech, I find the opposite to be true, but I'm just curious what your responses to that would be.
That was like my exact, which was, we actually just recently went to a founders event with Gigascale, and I met these people who, like the rocket scientists, and it was just so inspiring. I mean, there's this woman, and she's like thinking about how to take like captured carbon and turn it into like interesting plastics, and it was just like you're listening to all the innovation, and it's so inspiring. And so, if you actually look at the math, like you don't need every single one of these things to work. Like you need a portion of these things to work. And like, so from my perspective, it's like the doom and gloom almost goes away, because you actually see as like both I'm trying to do something, but you also meet all these people that are, from my perspective, doing like 10x more than I could ever do.
Yeah, I think I definitely had like pretty bad climate anxiety before working in this space. Mm-hmm. I think that working in the space and feeling like I'm doing everything that I can for my particular personality, it makes that go away. And also I think that's what drove me to work on the problem that I'm working on, which is trying to actually, like myself, be involved in removing as much carbon as possible directly. Right. So that's like, say what you will about what that says about me as a person. But like, to me, that means that I'm doing everything that I can. And that makes me feel better. And so I think that for folks who care, it perhaps like actually does the opposite and unwinds some of that anxiety, especially if you don't like scroll Twitter all the time.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I laugh, like my joke is like working in climate tech is like my mea culpa for kind of some of my bad habits that I've not quite broken yet, or like
sushi.
That's a good one, or like I have little babies, so like I sometimes need to Amazon Prime stuff, and I hate myself for it a little bit, and so I always laugh that I'm like, well, this is like what I'm doing to make up for it. But I also think that there's something really important in there about, especially when you meet like the rocket scientists and like how these people live their lives that's like so all in on this, and it feels like, how could I ever add up, or like how could these people see, like they're gonna see right through me. It's not just like the typical imposter syndrome, but it's also like she is not green, like she's not. There's so many vegans in my office, and I respect it so much, but like I do not have the energy to figure out that menu for my kids, and and it's just one of those things where it's reminding yourself that it's like just do enough, and just do what you can, and that is enough. But also, yes, I like to run head first into problems when they give me anxiety. So,
well, and I also think on that matter, like one of the things in climate is there does become this like echo chamber of like, oh, everybody's vegan. Well, like very small percentage of the population is vegan. Like everybody uses Amazon Prime, and part of it is like having that perspective when you're thinking about companies and consumers and businesses, because that is what's going to make the difference. Like consumers, like I was saying, even in like our space, we did a whole bunch of consumer research, and like the average consumer doesn't still care about climate, like the homeowner. It's like because it's an older generation. And so you have to think about like so bringing these diverse perspectives into the climate space is extremely important for the climate space to be successful. And that was sort of, like I said, the realization I had where I was like, oh, I can add value, is like, because if we don't add these diverse perspectives, it's like, people think, oh, if I sell this as net zero, somebody's going to give a care.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the hope. Yeah, no, I found it also incredibly inspiring to see the level of talent within the space, and you're like, if you could have these people's brains focused on anything, like this is the challenge that I would like them to be focused on. One last question, and then I'd love to open it up for audience Q&A. So if you all have questions, we can take a few minutes for that. But before we hop into that, I'm just curious, like you touched on the one group in terms of like networking, but one of the challenges that job seekers often have, or people who are thinking of switching, is just that they don't have any network in the space. Is there anything else that you recommend besides like being here and networking?
Climate Draft. I don't
What is
know.
it?
Climate Draft.
Okay.
It's like the best website. And it has a whole bunch of different companies. I've had like a number of people who found jobs off of there. And then they also have like advertised different events, whether it's like happy hours. I met really interesting people at one of their happy hours. So that site is awesome.
MCJ as well. Really great community, people doing all sorts of cool stuff. The other thing that's been really interesting, and this was not necessarily my original approach, but this may not be true if you're a little earlier in your career, but it's amazing how many people I was not aware have moved into the climate space that I worked with many years ago. Even the person who introduced me to Arbor is somebody I worked with long before this, who I just saw on LinkedIn was in this space and thought, might have some ideas. But I every day I'm running into people who it's like, oh my God, you from 10 years ago, you're in this space too. That's so great. So I think really thinking about the people that you know, scroll through your LinkedIn connections, see if people have changed jobs, because this is a space that there's a lot happening in right now. And it's just, it's very inspiring, and it makes me very happy to see how many amazing people are now in this space that I worked with, for years prior. And your vibe is your tribe. Like, I think the right people are very attracted to this type of thing, and so you'd be surprised the people that are already here.
Yeah, I got some really good advice from folks who are already in the space by just kind of like reaching out. And I'm in sales, so I would do that, but I would encourage you guys to do that too. So just send a bunch of LinkedIn messages and like see what sticks. Like, a bunch of people are not going to have time to respond to you, and that's fine, right? But someone might, and that's a good thing. And I think a lot of folks in the space are really generous with their time, and they want more people to come into the space. And everybody wants to find climate solutions, so they want everybody working on it. So when folks do have time, I think that they're open to mentorship and they're open to connections. So I would say just reach out. Yeah.
And just to add to that too, like if people don't get back to you, or if they are slow, you don't take any of that personally, because there's just so much going on in everybody's lives, and you don't know what happened the second they opened your email. And one of the biggest challenges I think back about is how, and I still, I just talked about imposter syndrome already. It's like when somebody doesn't get back to you, it has nothing to do with you, and just keep trudging along. You never know the connection that's going to do the thing. And, you never know when, like, nobody's remembering. I don't know, maybe Taylor Swift does, like who the people in the background are that didn't respond to their emails, so just like reach out. Don't be afraid if people don't get back to you. Don't think it's a you thing. Don't let that stop you.
I think having been in sales or being in recruiting really helps you with that, because for us, like, I remember when I first started out, if 3% of the people we reached out to got back to us, that was like great. We were super excited. And I always remember this phrase, one of the women who, when I was trying to transition into tech, actually, she said, just be pleasantly persistent. And that always stuck with me. Like, my tone when I reach out to people and try and get them to network is just like pleasant persistence, oh, it's me again. And it generally, for me at least, it's worked. So I'd love to open it up to Q&A. I have more questions I want to ask as well, but I want to give you all a chance. So I know there's a couple people, maybe Mike and Meryl have microphones out there. And I would say if you have a question, you can just raise your hand, and someone will bring around a mic to you.
And if not, I have a question too, so I can kick it off. But any hands up if anybody wants to ask a question? Great.
Thanks again for this. It was really interesting, the panel. I guess the question I have, and I'm transitioning from consulting like you, so very broad skill set, thinking about like, what can I do? And I've done quite a bit of climate energy work, but like picking one seems really challenging because all of the stuff sounds really, really interesting. So yeah, I guess that's my question.
How do you pick one? Maybe I shouldn't say this, I don't know, but honestly, like, you make your story up a lot as you go, right? Especially consulting, it's a lot of like drinking from the fire hose, especially like kind of old school management consulting, drinking from the fire hose. And so it's kind of hard. You can pick and choose so many different things about your journey. And I don't think there's anything wrong with picking and choosing your story for the audience that you're talking to at that time. I mean, that's especially because if you really look for the through lines of like, what about those consulting projects were you attracted by? Or, you know, what are the problems that you solved while you were doing that? People don't double click that hard, and it's for a good reason. It doesn't mean just because you didn't do something for 2 full years, you only did it for 6 weeks with the client, doesn't mean you didn't learn exactly what you needed to know to be able to apply to the next thing. The other thing I would say is I accepted anything that came my way, and I didn't say no to anything. That was tricky from a burnout perspective, but this is a problem I've always dealt with my whole career. But it helped me learn so much about, you know, where I could apply myself in this space. And I just didn't say no to anything, even if it sounded like kind of boring or a nightmare.
And then the only thing I'd add to that is like, because the space is so new, there's nothing more important than the people. So like when you're talking to different, I mean, everyone knows like when you're interviewing as much about you getting to know them, but understanding what those people have done in there. Like, I mean, I'm a big believer in backdoor reference checks, but like on the company as well. But it's like, because everything is so new and everyone's trying to feel their way into what's a business model, like, you know, whether it's carbon capture or whether it's anything, like who's going to pay for it? There's so many questions. And so a lot of it is going to be the resilience of the founders and the team. And so I think focusing a lot on the actual people in the room is very important.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I was in that process of reaching out to a bunch of people, I'd spoke to someone at Breakthrough Energy, Aaron Bernstein, who was very generous with his time. And he told me something that's perhaps very obvious, but he put it very clearly, which is that when you're picking a role, and the same thing goes when you're hiring, but in, you know, the other direction, the most important things are like team, role, and then mission, and it's in that order. And so I think that it's important to just keep that order in mind, because if the team doesn't work, then it doesn't matter what you're doing day to day, and it doesn't matter
because the product market fit and all these solutions is still being figured out.
Yeah, your job's going to change every day, kind of no matter what. And so I think that there's actually a lot of value you can pull by saying you've worked on 100 different things, because I do 100 different things every day. So,
Anyone else? Other questions?
Hi, yes, I have the exact opposite question. What if you've figured out what your path is, you want to leverage maybe a very specific past scientific domain, and how do you then go about, there are so many options. How do you find the way to apply kind of maybe a narrow field? How do you find those specific opportunities in this sea of big opportunities, I guess?
Talk to the venture capitalists. Yeah, they know.
It's like, it's academia and venture capitalists. Like both of those pieces often know who are the companies that are spinning out or who are the companies already established in those spaces.
Yeah, if you go to ctvc.com or .co, I think they have a list of all the climate tech venture firms out there, and you can filter by like deep tech or other things like that. And then often the VCs will list jobs in their portfolio companies. So, or you can reach out to them and say, hey, this is especially if you're a technical person and you reach out, they'll probably want to talk to you. I don't want to speak out of turn for you guys, but I think that's true. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the great panel. My name is Kavi, and I'm at an odd point in my career. I'm at 29 years old, and for the first time, folks are trying to ask me, how do I break into climate? So I'm looking for some advice on how do you be a better mentor? Being able to point them to resources is something I've done, sharing my story, trying to build relationships, so you're just a person, they can come back and talk to you. But I don't feel very helpful. Is there any advice you have on like how do you grow to be a better mentor?
I love that question, and I think it's so important. And it's something I often say is that everything in life is temporary except the people. And you never know when some of these things are going to circle back around. And you never know when something you said to somebody is going to resonate for them later. And, it's hard to get that direct feedback loop. So I think you kind of just have to trust that by putting it out there, you're doing the right thing and that it's going to help somebody somewhere. And we all kind of have to keep putting ourselves out there and trying to make the problem better. This is true on like a lot of levels. Even if you're not getting that immediate feedback loop. But all the advice here today, the things you can point people to, and I cannot tell you how many people I have mentored over the years that are now doing killer things that I'm very grateful that they, will do anything I ask. And, it's like, but that wouldn't have been the case 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think just keep putting yourself out there and helping people and having that perspective.
I'd just add to that, I think the other key is getting the person who's asking for mentorship to be clear about what they're looking for. Because it's like, especially if they can give you that ahead of time, then it allows you to reach out to your network, potentially, even if you don't know that direct answer before you spend time and be like, oh, yeah, here's what you're looking for. I was able to get these 3 or 4 resources. Let's talk through them or whatever. And, so a lot of times it's structuring the conversation that is going to have a really big impact for your ability to help them.
Yeah, I think for me, like, I don't always feel like I have awesome advice to give from my own experience. And I think what I do have to offer is like my network. And in that case, the person really needs to know what they're looking for. So often I end up just like trying to help them think through that. And then I try to be as generous as possible with my connections. And I think that's kind of the all I can do at this point in my career. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I agree with all of that. And I think one of the things I often hear is, so something I think you can do also is give them honest feedback that they might not be getting from other quarters. So when people are applying to jobs, they don't get the job and there's no feedback on why, or, sometimes they'll tell me what the feedback was and I can kind of read between the lines and say, what I think they're trying to say is X, Y, Z. So I think sometimes sometimes we feel like when people are looking for jobs that we want to just like build them up, and give them, make them feel positive. But I actually think one of the best things that you can do is also be very direct about where you see the gaps and what they might need to work on, or help them interpret feedback that they're getting. That's a great question. All right, let's see. I think we maybe have one more over on this side, or may have seen a hand. Oh, there we go.
Hi, I don't have a specific question. I just want to bring up another organization that is doing monthly events about energy topics. It's called Young Professionals in Energy, SF Bay Area, and it's a group of volunteers. So we are hosted by energy companies, and we have really fun events. Some people already went to them in this room, and many people found jobs through the connections that they made. So please join. And our website is ypsfbayarea.org, so you can sign up and come.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, a recording of this would be a good thing to just give someone who's starting out in the space.
I have a question, and this is sort of probably a non-linear one in the sense that I have probably 15 plus years of career. I worked at Google, I worked in consulting, and I'm at this inflection point where I'm actually friends with rocket scientists, and we have been talking about ideas in climate tech. And the question is, I know I also saw that some of you guys entered climate tech and started working, as a COO, but some of you guys went and founded companies. So this is a decision that I've been debating with my wife as well. Like, should I spend time actually trying to take some of these ideas and build products, or should I actually go work for a climate tech company before I go do that? So I just would love to get some perspective.
I mean, I'm a little biased because I love founding companies, but I feel like that spending if you have that time to be able to do some of the research and try and, very much talk to the customers. Like, I don't know if you'd be selling into businesses or selling into consumers or figuring out again, we did a huge amount of research when we were looking at, I knew I could have impact on consumers. So we were like, okay, it's food waste, transportation, or residential energy. So looked into all those three spaces, brainstormed different ideas, looked and, landed on residential energy, and then did, again, a huge amount of research in the space in terms of what companies are already out there, talk to thousands of consumers. There's a very cool SurveyMonkey product. And if you want to talk to a lot of consumers for a good price, but or businesses, is like talking to the people who would be buying your product is like the absolute most important thing. And as you're innovating and testing and trying, but it's like there's nothing more fun in my mind. Like I've worked for other people, I've built my own. It's like there's nothing more fun than starting your own company and building. It takes longer to get to scale and to get product market fit, but having that excitement, like there's nothing more exciting than that, is my opinion.
I feel like it's such a personal question, right? And it's funny because I went through a bit of a period as well when I was consulting, and once I was kind of out of like the super new mom mode, where I thought, maybe I do want to do my own thing rather than go back to being a COO again or consulting, whatever that looks like. And I think who knows what my future holds, but what I realized is what I really cared the most about was being able to do something where I just felt like I could make a big difference and I could bring my knowledge to bear, and that can happen a lot of different ways. And like when it came to Arbor, what those guys are trying to do, what we're trying to do, and just the way that I saw Brad and Andreas's vision and how they came up with it, it just seemed like so much bigger than anything that I could do right now myself. And so it just felt like that was a much better way to align what I was looking for than to try to found something myself. And so I think so much of it is just about like where you're at in life, what you're trying to get out, Young babies makes it really hard to think about doing stuff like that too. But it's such a personal thing that I think you're also, life is long. I tell myself that a lot. Like I'm doing this now, maybe forever, but also maybe there's something else out there for me later too.
Yeah, I think it's very much a personal question, and it depends on the idea, it depends on the space you're looking to get into, and would be happy to chat afterwards if you, yeah.
I think
I
we have
have a
time for
question
one
from
last
the
question.
internet. This is about how do you get the attention of talent acquisition or hiring managers so you can have the opportunity to tell your story?
I mean, you can answer that, but my perspective is like you have to network your way into the companies at this point. Like finding like just going through just the pure application process rarely works.
Yeah, I think that, some of the stuff that we talked about in terms of LinkedIn and finding, I always say if you don't know anybody, if you have no connections to anyone in the company, figure out who you think the hiring manager for the job would be, figure out who you think it's actually probably more important to get the attention of the hiring team than the recruiting team or the talent acquisition team. So I usually say find 3 people who you think are like well positioned, and that means either you think they're the hiring manager for the job or they have some kind of tangential similarity to you. So like the ideal and clearest case would be like, oh, they went to my same school or whatever it might be. But something that seems similar, and reach out to at least 3 people when you apply and say, hey, I already applied, because that's generally a prerequisite. Like I just sent in my application and here's like, I'd love to chat with you about it, and here's a reason why. So short and sweet, but minimum of 3 people within the company.
I think, not to harken back on something I said before, but especially now that I'm hiring, I see a lot of people who apply for jobs and there's nothing that resonates on their resume about that job. And I think a lot of times we try to look for buzzwords, or we hear these kind of general pieces of advice, but roles and responsibilities is one thing. Especially if you're trying to change industries or you don't have the exact title that was needed before, really think about what that JD is asking for, what you think that job could do, and then write your bullet points and a cover letter accordingly so you can explain that story as well. Especially if you're talking about early companies, it's pretty easy to get my attention. I'm the one looking at all the applications, right? But what I see so often is that people don't seem to put in the effort to be thinking a lot about that role. And when you're just kind of spraying your resume out, you kind of get what comes back to you.
Yeah, just tactically too, a lot of people spend more time on their resume than their LinkedIn, and generally LinkedIn we find is what people are first looking at. So your first impression is going to be LinkedIn. So, people spend 6 hours on their resume and 15 minutes on LinkedIn. It probably should be switched. And then we also recommend if you're looking at a lot of companies, tiering them out. So maybe like Arbor is in your tier 1 because that is the job you want and the space you want to be in. So you maybe have 5 companies in tier 1 where you're going to just spend an hour getting your application right and detailing it and reflecting the JD and making sure that it's really tight and right on. And then you have your tier 2, which is like, this would be great, but not as high. And then your tier 3 might be where you're just, applying in a much more blanketed way, but still reaching out to at least 3 people at that company. So that way you can save your time and your energy for the things that are the most important.
Another thing too to call out is there's 2 different approaches, right? You can look for the exact job you want and try to figure out how to get that job. But to like Natalie's earlier point, sometimes you just kind of need to get your foot in the door in a way. And so maybe this is more of a deductive exercise where you go through the people you know or the companies you may have connections to and have those conversations and see where they're at or if they have an opportunity to hire an open headcount, rather than just looking at, the open headcount that is out there and focusing on, the jobs. I always tell people when I give advice that you should not look at JDs as your first thing that you do, because you spin on that. If you're trying to go find something new, sit with yourself and figure out what job you want to do and how you can tell your story the best, and then go out and figure out like where are there jobs like that or where are there companies like that that could have those conversations. If you just start by scrolling monster.com or LinkedIn jobs, you'll spin out.
That's great advice. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. Oh, one more question.
there one more?
Okay, one more question.
Thank you for an incredible panel. Similar to a couple transitioning out of management consulting, and after many years, this is my first big career pivot. And so the comment about team being number 1 in your assessment really resonates. What would you say are the big things to talk to the teams? Like, what are the questions that come to mind when you're assessing if this is going to be a good fit for you?
One of the, and I mentioned it before, one of the key things is, because you're pivoting, is understanding, hey, like when I hit a hurdle where maybe I don't know something about the space, like, can you give me an example of a time where you've helped somebody else? Or, it's you have as much opportunity, and it's important that you're sort of like interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. And so ask for like specific case study, like give them a case. Like, if I hit against this hurdle, what would you do to help me? Like, that's a totally fine thing to do, and see like what their response is. So from my perspective is like, the more you can sort of things that are going to be important to you is like give them those examples and see how they answer you.
Yeah, I think like spending, I think this is true of all startups, not just climate tech startups, but spend a lot of time with the folks you're going to work with if it's a small team, and try to spend some time in an office, outside of an office, do like different types of things with them and get to know them more than you think you should. That like I've made that mistake where the team just wasn't a fit at a startup I was at, and it can be really painful. And I think just take the time, spend the time, and and I think a good sign of a good team also is that they know what their work style is, and they should be able to express that to you, and not just we always talk about on our team, we always talk about the word collaborative because it's really important to us, but it's really squishy too. Like if you ask someone, are you collaborative? They're going to be like, yes.
Exactly.
So you have to really like think about what does that mean for us effectively? Like what are the actions that we take that make us collaborative? And we ask a lot of questions about that. Like, what does that mean to you? Like, and that's something that we do in our interview process to screen for that, because it's really hard to screen for.
One thing I really like to do, and I give advice for people, is like ask them what's broken, ask them what doesn't work. If it's they're replacing somebody for that role, what happened with that last person? If it's a new role, what did they think this person's biggest challenges are going to be? And just kind of asking those hard questions and seeing how they handle those answers, because you interview the company as much as they interview you. Another thing worth calling out, especially coming from like big consulting or strategy consulting, big companies in general, is the stage a company is at is really, really important. Your job is going to be very different when you are at a seed company versus a company that's a Series C or even profitable. And there's a lot of different types of ways of getting work done that may not resonate with anything you've done in the past because you don't have the resources you might have at a big company or a big firm, or, you know, you have to be able to change the toner cartridge, you know. It seems like silly, but it's something I constantly see people really take for granted on both sides, you know, as the company and as the people hiring that. And if you don't like changing the toner, you know, then that's probably not the right environment for you. But if you really like being scrappy and you come from a big company, that's okay. Be sure to really call out where you were scrappy, right? Like, I actually always say that my time at Deloitte as a management consultant was the most entrepreneurial thing I've done, you know, because so much of what you're navigating is just figuring out from scratch how to become an expert in something overnight. And that is so much about founding too. But frame your story accordingly, because otherwise it doesn't resonate very well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists and to Jill, please? Thank you all for coming out there. In addition to our panelists, there are a couple of teams out in the lobby who, if you haven't chatted with, are hiring. So Mill is here hiring across a variety of roles. Dioxycle looking for electrochemists and business operations folks. And the team from Terra.do, which is the course that Selina mentioned, is here as well. So find your way back into the lobby and you can chat with some more folks. Thanks for coming out.